Hi, everyone. My apologies for switching the Google Hangout at the last minute. I have never used Google Hangouts on air before, so will try not to break it again. Is there any way for you to tell me whether the sound on this is working? I know there is a Q&A button on the left here, but when I click it, it says it's disabled. So it's not clear to me how you can let me know what your questions are, etc. Actually, I'm going to make a pirate pad for this purpose, since Google Hangouts on Air does not seem to have options. Testing Hangout chat. Let me do that and drop the link somewhere in here. Let's see. The thing where I leave links is also disabled. Oh, wait. Maybe if I click that. No, that's just links to this page. All right, well, oh, I see. That's a somewhat inefficient way to give me feedback, but great. I'm going to leave this. I just posted it to the event page, a link to the testing Hangout chat, which might be a more effective way to for folks to chat. I don't know how many people are going to end up being here, but I just wanted to have a way for you guys to ask questions that's easy for me to manage. So I'm going to go through and get started. And if you have any questions, you can put them on this pad and maybe put a little plus before it so that I know that it's a question. Oh, actually, don't do that. Put an asterisk before it so you know it's a question. This is a question. And then if other people have the same question, they can add plus after it, like a +1 or like a yes or like a really want to know. So I can just get a sense of what the most pressing questions are. And maybe if Carol can just keep an eye on that and try to draw my attention to the most important questions. It's unclear to me how many people are coming. It looks like half a dozen now, but there are something like 90+ signups on the Eventbrite page. So who knows? This might be all a lot of organizational process for nothing. But I just want to make sure that I answer any of your questions because we're going to be covering a lot of stuff today. With that being said, let's get started. I was thinking that it would be easier to give to have interaction between all of you and me. So I was going to start with a discussion about people's experiences with testing and why you would even want to do testing in the first place. But that doesn't seem like it's easy to do. When I was looking at the Google Hangouts on Air facts earlier, it said that up to 10 people could join Hangouts on Air. So if anyone wanted to join me to discuss, we could do that, or you could do that. I have no idea how you do that. But I'm going to give it like 10 seconds, 15 seconds now for someone to join me, just to have a little discussion about testing, your experiences with testing, why you want to learn about it. If I had easily accessible Jeopardy countdown music, I would do that now. Whoa, there's a link to a chat. This is great. This is a great supplement. Excellent. So if any of you don't know, there is, which I didn't know, there is a highly used remote chat, which I just got linked to. Still seems like it's useful to have the question pad for the pirate pad for questions, but that is also useful for interacting with each other. Okay, so I'm just going to try and keep an eye on everything. It's a little bit different from doing an in-person workshop where all of this would flow together. But basically just ping me if you have questions. And I'll do less of the discussion-y element that I usually really like to have in my workshops. Cool, so testing. what we're going to do today is I made a little demo project for us to go through and build and test together. And my goal with this workshop is to cover, the goal of the workshop is to cover a few different types of testing, because there's a number of different situations in which you'd want to test, and you're not going to get to be a master at any of them in just a couple of hours, but you can get a sense of what they are, why they use them, and in a couple of cases, like the nitty-gritty of how to do the basics of them. So there's a bit of a contradiction here, though, in doing a toy project around testing, which is that testing is all about complexity management. The more complex your project is, the more people contributing to it, the more moving parts it has, the more you need testing. So the sort of like motivation for testing with a toy project is actually not that great, because you're like, this is something we can make in a couple of hours. Probably you could get away without testing it at all. But I tried to use a toy project to keep things pretty simple and straightforward, so that you all could get a sort of mental image of a mental model of what the project is and how the tests interact with it. So I made there's a GitHub repository for this demo, which I will share with you in the many different places. So I have not actually joined the PyLadies remote chat. Authorize my app. Great, I'm leaving the link in the PyLadies chat as well as on the Pirate Pad, and while I'm at it, I will put it on the Google Hangouts on Air page. Great. So that is the demo repository. So is everyone, I'm going to narrate the process of cloning a repo from GitHub. Maybe you guys already know that. I would take a show of hands, but it seems not worth it to do the digital equivalent of that. But if you have any questions about how to clone a repository from GitHub, or how to create a GitHub profile, you can ask in the chat, and there's probably, well, definitely Carol can help you, and there may be other people in the chat as well who can help you with the details of that. So I'm going to switch over to screen sharing now. Temporary recursion. Great. All right, so I'm going to go to the Python testing demo, and I'm going to open up a terminal. And I'm going to type. So at this point, I'm logged into my GitHub account. In order to do this, you'll need to have, actually, you might not need to have an account just to copy the repository, because you're just pulling it. You're not pushing to anything. So you can try just doing a git clone. You might not have Git installed. If you're having trouble getting it installed, you can ask in the PyLadies chat, or you can sort of follow along without actually doing anything. Great, so now that I've cloned it, I should be able to change directories into it, and I have the very basics of site. So I'm gonna get started by opening up this folder in my text editor of choice, which is Atom. And I've already got it opened up. Great. So just to do a little bit of setup. To do a little bit of setup, if you've got virtual env installed, what I like to do is to create a virtual environment. This is not a necessary step. You can skip it. But I'm going to do so. And then to start your virtual env, you type source space, and now you can see right here that I'm actually in my virtual env. And so a virtual environment is basically a way to keep, so any given project will likely have a number of dependencies, whether that's in a Python project, the Python language itself, or various Python modules, etc. Different projects might have different dependencies, and some of those dependencies might conflict with each other. So having a virtual environment allows you to keep different versions of different dependencies separate. So one tool, another tool you can use, so I have a requirements.txt file, which is a list of dependencies for this project. It's not very large, but it does include the Selenium Python testing tool, and it includes Mako templates and a couple of other things. So I can type pip install requirements.txt, which is going to go through and install all of those things for me. And it should be pretty quick. I'm just going to pause to take a look for the questions. This is such a different workflow and experience from doing a live thing. Great, it looks like there are not any questions at the moment. So back to my stuff. All right, great. So now we've done the basic setup for the project. We've got our requirements installed. So I'm just going to run you through what I've set up already in this repository. The main thing that I've got set up is this Python file create_site.py, and that's going to be where we're building our tool today. And right now it's very simple. It's using the very basics of the Mako template system, where basically you're defining a template here, a very simple template. It just says hello world, and then you're writing it to a file. And so to create a template, you just use this template object, which you feed it in basically a string, and then in here you call render on it to get the output string. And you might say to yourself, right now it doesn't look any different from, why can't we just feed a string directly into indexfile.write? And if all we wanted to say was hello world, we could do exactly that. But we're going to build out from there and do stuff that's more complicated. So what happens when we run this? So I'm going to go, I'm going to clear this and make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so hopefully that helps people see things well. And maybe let me know if you're having trouble seeing any of the code I'm writing. Great, so we're going to go ahead and we're in the right section. So we're going to go ahead and run Python create_site.py. And it doesn't give any output because we didn't tell it to give us any output when it ran successfully. But if we do an ls now to see the contents of the directory, we see that there is one new file, and it's this index.html file, which has been generated. And because index.html is a generated file, I don't have it under version control. In retrospect, I'm not sure that's a particularly relevant fact, but there you go. In case you're poking around with the repository and wondering where things are. So we've generated this index.html file. Well, what does it look like? So one thing we could do to look at this index.html file is open it up in our browser by just going to File, Open. But there's actually a better way for us to do this, and that's by using a simple command, which is python-m simple HTTP server. And when we do this, we serve up whatever's in this repository on localhost. So it's going to display that index.html on whatever browser we use at 0.0.0 port 8000. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up so you can see it. And it says, hello world. Great. Excellent. So that's the sort of overview of what our workflow is going to be. We're going to be editing create_site.py, running it, seeing the changes. And then we're also going to be testing it. Pausing. Don't see any questions. Great. All right, so the first thing we want to do is maybe add a little bit of complexity to our project, because a site that says hello world is, you know, just a site that says hello world. But what if we could say hello to anything? So I happen to know, because I learned this yesterday, that Mako templates take variables, and the format for that is a $, and then curly brackets, and inside you put the name of a variable. So thing to greet is what I'm going to call this variable. And then in where it says my template.render, you can assign an actual value to the variable. So I'm going to say, hello, Pilates remote viewers. So I'm going to go ahead and run this again, except I'm going to have to open up a new window because the old one is interesting. The old one has stuff in it. So I'm going to run that again. And when I go back here and refresh it, interesting. I would have expected that to update. All right, well, I'm going to open up the index.html file. Weird. Let me delete that. Oh, I see what's happening. Sorry about that, folks. So I made this yesterday, and this is the version of the repository that I made yesterday. So I'm just going to copy this, open up the version that I just copied to. I basically have two repositories in two different places. So I should have something on file system. Where are you, PyDemo? Where did I put you? All right, I know how to find where I put this. I am in print working directory, home Shauna Python testing demo. All right, so I'm going to open Python testing demo. These are the types of things that people tell you. This is why people tell you not to do live demos, but I believe it shows you that everyone gets confused sometimes. And you are not alone when you get confused. I get confused all of the time. So I'm going to close this and copy and paste my changes here. And now when I run python create site.py, I am running the changed file because I have changed the actual file as opposed to the other one. And now it should say, there we go. All right, excellent. Okay, so that's the basic of templating. So in an effort to stick to the demo I created, so I created this like fairly detailed README yesterday for this demo, and I'm not planning to stick to it word for word. So it might not actually be that helpful to read along with, but I'm going to do my best to try to stick to it from memory. We'll see how that goes. So let's make a website. I happen to love animals and pictures of animals, and I have yesterday gathered some pictures of animals to prepare us for today. And so I would like to make a website that displays pictures of animals. So why don't we change our template to, instead of saying hello whatever, let's change it so it is an image tag. So we're going to create the tag here. I'm going to use single quotes so as not to get confused with the encasing quotes. And I'm going to call this image URL. And then here, instead of saying Pilates remote viewers, which is not an image URL, I'm going to include a link to one of these images. So let's go with this. So this should work. It's got a link to my image URL, and it's going to create a file and just stick that within the image tag. So I'm going to go ahead and run Python create site. Nope. So name error undefined. I go back and look. Does anyone, I'm going to attempt to make this interactive. Does anyone know what went wrong? Again, there's a name error. It's saying that something's undefined on line 6, which is this line here. That's actually not that helpful of an error, but maybe you've captured it anyway. Does anyone want to say into PyLadies Remote what the error is? All right, I do not see anything in there. Yes, all right, great. Someone, multiple people now. Yes, okay, great. So there is a chance to be interactive with this. Excellent. Right, so as several people on PyLadies Remote have pointed out, I changed the name of the image, the variable name in the template, but I didn't change what I was feeding in. So now if I do that again, it should run, and it does. And when I go to my site and refresh it, I get an image of a guinea pig. Excellent, excellent. So we've got an image, great. But we don't, it's just an image. We don't have a name for the image, and we don't have any credit or attribution to the person who took the image. So let's add that. So I'm going to add to my template some additional information. I'm going to add a paragraph. And in the paragraph, I'm going to add the image. I'm going to add a link to, so I got all of these images from Pixabay, which is a site which hosts Creative Commons public domain licensed images, CC0 images. So I am going to call that Pixabay image URL as opposed to the URL that we've got locally. And then I'm going to just put this on multiple lines for readability's sake. Then we'll have a link to the creator. So we'll call that creator URL. And then one more variable, which is just going to be creator. Close that, and then we should get some, so we have 4 total options. Image URL, Pixabay image URL, creator URL, and creator. And you could go get these from Pixabay, but I actually have them here, which we're going to use eventually. But for now, let's just use these. And so I need to feed these in here as well. So let's call this Pixabay image URL, creator URL, and actually let's call that creator name and creator name. And so we've got this, we've got this. We have the user's URL, and then we have the user's name. We'll bring this back up. And if I have not made any typos, that should render just fine. Promising. Now when we refresh this, we get down here credit. And if I click this, it brings me to the image on Pixabay. When I click this, it brings me to the user's page. So now we have given people credit where credit is due. I'm going to just take a pause to look at pictures. Great. Sorry, take a look at questions. Cool. So we now have a simple image being displayed. I am mad with power, and I want to make another image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write again, but with different data, I'm going to go back to my images CSV and grab the data for the second image, which is going to be a cat. And then actually, let's put that cat down here. Here. And excellent. I'm going to run that again, and we should have 2 images. Look at that. Great. So we've got a couple different images here. But so what we've got now, every time I want to add a new image to this file, I need to copy and paste this sort of like 4-line piece of code. And, you know, what if I want to put, you know, 10 or 100 or 1,000 images on here? I don't want to be writing this. It's not dry, which is the sort of stands for don't repeat yourself. And then if I decide to change the URL name, I have to change it. So if I decide to change a variable name, I would have to change it in 100 or 1,000 different lines. So there's got to be a way for us to refactor this code so that we are not we're not copying ourselves over and over again. And so my chosen way to do this is to create a object. So I'm going to call this class adorable image object. So I'm going to inherit from object. And I'm going to start by defining an init statement, which basically is just what happens when we call this object, when we create the object. And I'm going to feed it self, and I'm going to feed it a couple different things. I'm going to feed it image URL. I'm going to feed it the list of variables here. I'm going to assign it to the things that come in so that we can reference them whenever other functions we create. And then, no, I didn't need to autocomplete that way. I noticed that already. That's a creator name, not an image URL. Creator name. Excellent. That's my init statement. And I also want to create a render statement. So I want to render using my template. So I'm going to copy this here, return. I do this way. So I feed in the you might have noticed that this is still a lot of typing, but it's going to, and a lot of code, but it's going to scale a bit more because we're only having to do this once. Great. And then, so where am I actually getting this my template to render to? So I need to create one more variable, or one option is to create one more variable, which is self.template, which I'm going to name. So we're going to call this template. Actually, let's put it at the beginning. And then just for elegance's sake, we'll put that up at the beginning. Excellent. So now, now we can create our objects. So object list is equal to, we'll call it pig object, which is equal to adorable image object, and we feed it in these things. And then we can also create a cat object, which is the same thing. You have to add template equals my template. We'll do the same thing for both of them, but we're just repeating ourselves here. We'll check to make sure it works, so we actually do need to do a little bit more refactoring. We'll do this as, we'll create a list of object list is equal to pig object at object. And then we can iterate through this object list for item in object list. And we can call item dot render. And if we have not made any errors, which seems unlikely, but is always possible, we can now write both of these. And so we shouldn't actually see anything change. Everything should just work. Keyword can't be an expression. Line 14. Oh, I got that reversed. We want to have the self call here. Try that again. All right, so everything should look the same, and it does. So we've successfully refactored. And that is actually an example of testing. It's just not automated testing. It's a manual test I did to check that my changes didn't cause any changes to the behavior that I wanted. All right, we're almost done with our setup, and we're just about ready to get to automated testing. But the last thing I want to do is refactor this section here where I've one by one created these objects. We need one more step in order to make this as automatic as possible, and that is to read in our data from a file. And once we do that, we can have 2 items in that file, or we can have 20 items in that file, or 1,000 items in that file, and we'll be able to handle all of them with the same set of code. So to do that, I'm going to import from CSV. I'm not going to remember the syntax, but I'm going to try. Actually, I am going to look it up on Google. CSV read, no, Python, just to copy and paste the code because I do not have it memorized. So I'm going to use that here and change it to suit my needs. So I'm opening images.csv, a CSV file, instead of eggs.csv. I can continue to call this spam reader if I want. And the delimiter is going to be not space, but comma. And then for each row, each of which represents a image, I'm going to create an object. So I start here, make that an empty list, and then for each row, I'm going to append to the empty list a new object, which is my adorable image object. And I happen to know, so we start with template is my template. And then I happen to know that I've put these in the CSV in the order that I've specified. So I know that getting image URL is just as simple as taking the first item in the row. Getting Pixabay image URL is the second item in the row. Is row 2. Name is row, the third item in the row. And then we can delete this. And should be able to run it. Right, because I have to delete that too. Excellent. So now when we run it, we manually go and check and see that it still looks the way we expect it to look. Almost are, let's see, which of these things do we want to do first? It looks like our links are correct, but we're feeding in 3. So yeah, so I forgot to put the row before that. So it's just feeding in 3 in a square bracket. So that should be easy enough to fix. done that. Great, that's working, but our images are still wrong. So let's take a look at, right, so it's only got the name. It doesn't have the location inside of the directory images. So let us add to our template here the directory images and try again. Success, excellent. All right, so we've done some work. We've now got the ability to add as many cute animal pictures as we want. They've got attribution, things are going great. Let's pause and take a moment to test. But before we do that, I'm just going to check in and see if there are any questions. All right, looks like there aren't any questions, or at least the questions that are being asked are being helpfully responded to by people in the PyLadies chat. So I'm going to go ahead and move on with testing. So the first thing I want to tackle is unit testing. So Python has a great system called unit tests. And the idea behind unit tests is you want to drill your code down into the smallest possible functions and features, into isolated chunks that you can individually test. And obviously, this isn't the only thing you want to see, because in the end, you've got a project that you want to work as a whole in an integrated way, as well as in all of its tiny little pieces. So there's additional types of testing as well, such as integration testing. But unit testing is a good way to start because it's so isolated and focused. So we're going to start there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a file. We're going to call it test. We're going to call it test_project.py. Naming conventions, you should start it with a test and then an underscore for test discoverability. And if you have multiple different things you're testing, usually it's considered good form to put the name of the thing you're testing as the test underscore. So for instance, we've only created this create site.py. So one perhaps a better way to name it would be to call it test_create_site. So that's clear to someone reading it what code you're testing with it. However, because we are only going to have this one file, I've decided to call it test project. But it's possible that there's a better naming scheme involved. Great, we're going to start by importing unit tests. And I'm going to write a very basic unit test. And the, let me look this up just to make sure I get it right. Unit test class. I do not have a great head for syntax, so I often forget the exact thing. So we're going to start by creating a class, and we're going to call it, let's call it test adorable image test case. And we're going to inherit from the test case, the base test case class from unit test. And so that's going to come with all sorts of useful tools, which we're going to quickly start using. So I have defined my class. And I'm going to start by just creating a simple test. So define a test, basic test. And it's just I'm going to type pass so we automatically pass. So this is like the very, very bare bones of a unit test. So let's go ahead and run it, even though we're not really running anything. So the syntax for this is Python -m unit test. And you'll see it should show up for you as a, so this is the basic output. It says ran 0 tests in 0 seconds. Okay, but we wrote a test. It's not a very good test, but we did write one, so why isn't it finding it? So one, you need to There may be more complex ways to get this to run with just bare unit test, but you can more specifically test a specific file. So we can feed it in create_site.py. Module object has no attribute.py. The other option, I feel like that should work, but the other option for now is type discover. All right, so when you type discover, it tells unit tests to go and find the whatever things that have the unit test syntax in your directory. And so the unit test syntax is basically that the file has the format test underscore and then the name, and that you have a class that inherits from test case, and that you have tests within here that start with test underscore. So if you took this out and wrote it as just basic test, you'll see that the test disappears. So it's important that you start with test underscore. I'm still really unclear on why that's not working, because there should be tests in there. Maybe that's something you guys know. I will check in a little bit. But for now, we've got it working with discover. Oh, wait, I have an idea. There we go. That was just complete brain fart on my part. So you feed it the test suite sort of straightforwardly rather than the thing you're testing. I bet if I go look at the questions now, it's going to be full of people saying, you're testing the wrong thing. All right, so you can either specify the individual test file, or you can just get everything through discover. And you can actually be even more precise than the file. You can get the individual class of tests. So we could do adorable image test case here. And again, we still get one test, and we can even get the actual specific test. And right now, being able to do all of those things from the command line is like, they're all the same thing. But when you have a big test suite with a lot of tests, being able to have this level of granularity is great. And we'll also see this when we do some of our testing with Selenium, which takes a lot longer than your average unit test. So if you got it all in the same test suite, but you only want to do the unit test and you want to skip the Selenium test, having a handy shortcut to just do the unit tests is very useful. I say that having made projects where it takes like 10 minutes to get through all of the browser testing. Okay, great. So let's actually put some content in our test. Well, I'm going to just pause and look at questions to see if there's anything. Excellent. I can't tell if I'm being very clear or I've just lost you all or it's just difficult to ask questions. There are still no questions, which means I'm just going to go right ahead and start writing a basic test. So what are some of the things we might want to test with our code? Well, what our code is mostly doing is taking in data and rendering it. So what that says to me is maybe what we should test is that it successfully takes in data and that it successfully renders it. So the first thing I'm going to test is whether it successfully takes in data, that is by creating this adorable image object. So in order to test this code, we're going to need to import it into our test case. So we're going to import from create site import adorable image. We're going to be feeding in my template, so I'll bring that in too. And you'll note that we're able to import a specific, we can import this variable, we can import this class, but it might actually be kind of difficult to import these sections here. And so that's part of why when you look at code, a lot of times people try to encapsulate functions in classes or methods. And that is in part so that you can easily import it into a test file to test. Because right now it's easier enough for us to test adorable image and to test my template, but it's kind of difficult for us to test that this code is working. But we're not going to be completionists anyway, so let's just focus on our adorable image object. So let's start with the basics. I want to test whether we can successfully create an adorable image object. So test create adorable image object. And you'll frequently see, if you look at a set of unit tests in code that people are using, that frequently the test names are very verbose. It's important to be able to tell what you're trying to test. A lot of times people will also have a note for humans that's specifying what's happening. But these are automated tests, so they're for the computer to run automatically, but at the same time, you're going to be constantly reading and rereading them, so you want to be able to know what you were thinking when you made it. Great, so let's create an object. We'll call it test object. We'll create an adorable image object, and we'll do something very similar to what we were doing before. No, I no longer remember. Okay, so we have template equals my template, image URL equals image.html. And I'm just going to come up with some random fake test data. What else do we need? URL is equal to .com/image URL. Creator URL is equal to when you're creating your test data, sometimes it's important, the specifics of what you're putting in, and sometimes it's not. For now, I'm just going to use these, but we might end up paying more attention to what we're actually feeding in there in a bit. Great, so we've got our test object, but how do we actually test it? So unit test cases come with a bunch of assertions, and these assertions are sort of like the heart and soul of the test cases. And there's a bunch of them, and we're just going to go over a few, but they're pretty great. I enjoy getting to try different ones. So we'll start with self-assert equal. Actually, let's look this up. I want an assertion that will let me test whether something is the same class as. So here's a whole list of assertions here. Class. Okay, let's go with assert is. Oh, that's what I had already. Well, such is life. So I want to test that adorable image is the same class as what I'm expecting. So let's call this class. That might not be the syntax, but we'll try. Well, it's telling me weird things, so maybe that's, yeah, I think that's what it wanted me to do. And then I can reference the class by looking at this object that I've imported in. So let's check if that works. Right. Let me go back to just testing the file as a whole. And it says run one test in 0.000 seconds. Okay. So great. So that means it's a success. And you can see this little dot here also indicates that it's a success. But what would have happened if it was wrong? Let's say I said it's the same class as my template. To do that, I get a F for fail. And helpfully, unit test provides a traceback for where the problem is, and it specifically uses its assertion error class to give you details about what went wrong. So my assertion was that the class of my object was the same as this template object, and it says the class that you specified is not the same as the class that we were given. One is createSite.AdorableImage, the other is mako.template.template. So if we didn't already know how to make this test pass, we could use this information to go fix it. So in addition to success as indicated by a dot and a failure as indicated by an F, there's another type of problem we can have, which is an error. So let's bring this back to what it should be. Actually, we're just going to get invalid syntax for that. Fine. All right. Let's induce an error in the creation of this object by giving it a random parameter that it doesn't know how to handle. Do that. And we'll put it at the beginning because you need to put the non-keyword arguments before the keyword arguments. There we go. Finally, I've got that error I've always wanted. So the third option is an error, and that's indicated by an E. And basically what this means is that you didn't even get to the assertion. You threw an exception somewhere along the line. So in this case, we did on line 9, which is basically part of this test object declaration. When we tried to do this, we threw an error. That's the 3 different options you can get. And as you do multiple tests, you'll see a whole string. You'll see that in just a few moments. You'll see a whole string of dots and E's and F's, hopefully a whole string of dots. When you get a whole string of dots on your test cases, that's very satisfying. Great, so I'm just going to pause to look for questions again. Cool, so let's pause to answer the question from Just Temporal, which is, what do I need to test? Does it always make sense to test something or not? So this is to me, testing is a trade-off. There are some people who swear by what's called test-driven development, which we can get to in a bit more detail if we have time, we'll see. But test-driven development, everything gets tested because you actually develop by creating tests first and building to those tests. So like I said before, testing is for complexity management. When I'm doing a toy project or a simple project, something that I'm either going to do once and then throw away, or something that's just very small, I don't always use testing because there's not a lot of complexity for me to manage. But I do try to use it whenever there's any sort of significant complexity. And so things that can cause complexity, a big one that a lot of people don't think about is the complexity of just time and human memory and forgetfulness. If I'm going to use something again in the future, like not a week from now, but a month from now or a year from now, I think I might come back to it. I try to include tests as well as other forms of complexity management, like good documentation, because that future Shauna is essentially another person. And I want her to have these tools to help manage complexity. Another reason might be if you're collaborating with multiple people. So this is why testing is great for open source projects as well as projects run by businesses or organizations or nonprofits or governments where you have multiple people coordinating with each other. So yeah, I try to think about what kind of complexity, like what is the most confusing or intricate part of this code and I kind of start there. And if it's something that really kind of just sits off by itself and doesn't interact with much, and it doesn't, it's not itself a very complicated structure, I might not test it, or I might put it low down on my priorities for testing. Yeah, so I'm not a purist about testing. I think it's really important to know how to do, and I think it's really important to do, especially the more complex something gets. But I also think it's kind of a judgment call about whether any individual section gets tested. Okay, so I feel like I have rambled long enough. I hope that was helpful. If not, feel free to have additional follow-up questions. Great, so let's move back to our test case. So we've got our image and we've created it, which is cool. What else can we test here? We can test that it's rendered the way that we want it to. So we can do test image renders. Actually, we're going a little bit slower than I expected. So we'll skip testing the rendering, even though that's totally a thing we could test, and move on to testing giving the object a weird set of data. So let's say test create adorable image object with missing data. So as the name of this test suggests, what I'm going to try to do is create the object and give it not enough data and see what happens. So let's get rid of this random parameter, and we'll say that this is correct data. Actually, you know what? Let's start with too much data because we already sort of touched on that. So now I want to see what happens when we give the adorable image object too much data. And so I'm going to just run this again, even though we know what's going to happen. Right, so we can see over here, our first test passes because we get fed it the correct data, but our second test fails. Here's the question. Do we actually want our adorable image object to throw an exception if we give it too much data? If we do want that to happen, we can assert that it will raise an exception. And the syntax for this is, I'm going to look it up because I don't have it memorized. Assert, I think it's assert raises. Yes. Yeah. So let me use the syntax here. You'll notice that the ordering here is a little bit different. In the first test, we create our test object and then we assert it. Here, we hide, or we put our object creation inside of this assertion. And that's just because we want to be able to capture the exception that gets raised. So we're going to replace do something with this test object creation. We're just going to get rid of this here. And we need to replace some exception with the actual exception we expect. And if we look here, we see that the type of exception is a type error. So we'll replace this with a type error because that's what we expect to see. We'll run it again. And now this error that we expect is a passing test. And so one thing we could also do, we might decide that rather than just expect for this to fail, we might say, well, what if the CSV file that we're reading in is corrupt and there's like a random extra thing in there? Do we actually want to just like have there be an error and have the whole script come running to a fault? Because we're capturing the exception here, but we're not capturing the exception in the project itself. In the project itself, having incorrect data would still break it. So the fact that we've done this is like, great, we got our test case to pass, but we're not actually testing the code in the way we want. That's the sort of perennial question when you're testing and things are unusual is, do you match your, do you change your tests to match the code, or you change your code to match the tests. And so in this particular case, it seems like it would actually be pretty useful for us to come up with a way for our durable image object to survive when being given bad data. And so one way to do that is to use this piece of Python syntax, which basically you can add asterisk args. It actually can be named anything, but it's for readability's sake, just call it args. And that takes non-keyword arguments and it just captures them. And so you can use them within the within your init to say unused args is, or if in our case you just want to accept them and drop them, you can just bring them in and never use them. And so if we run this again, we're still raising an exception. So because otherwise that would fail. So I did something wrong here. Well, one way to see this is to create another test, which is the non-passing version of this, which will then give me a trace back. So let's do it. Try that again. Got multiple values for keyword argument template. I don't understand what you mean. It might be because this random parameter here is at the beginning instead of the end. Oh, it might be an ordering thing. Let me just, because they're being fed in as keyword arguments. So I'm not actually 100% on this. So the way that arguments typically work when you're feeding them in Python is that you want your non-keyword arguments. So for instance, if you look down here, if you took this away, my template will just fit into whatever the first argument is. But because we're specifying the keyword argument, then, so that's probably what's happening. To be honest, I have not thought this through. So this is me debugging it as we go along. Maybe the way to test this is, so right now I've put this random parameter first because in Python you're supposed to put the non-keyword arguments before the keyword arguments. But in my definition up here, I'm putting in the rest of the arguments that way. I'm going to just check and see if any of you smart people have, let's see. Carol says, required named parameters, arguments, keyword arguments. Are named parameters and keyword arguments the same thing, Carol? And if not, can you tell us the difference? I'm gonna Great. So, all right. So let's think this through. In our test project, we're feeding in one non-keyword parameter and 5 keyword parameters. But notice that they're all required keyword parameters because we haven't created any defaults for them. So we have 5 required name parameters. Keyword arguments typically have a key value pair. Arguments are typically named, but optional parameters. Right. Okay. So required name parameters, arguments, keyword arguments. So let's just use this here. Capture, and then So we have our named password, and then we have parameter. So these things don't have to have keywords. So one option is to create something with them. And then this, I believe, should pass because we're just feeding in 6 parameters. Yeah, so it's passing because we're feeding in 6 parameters, and it's just catching and getting rid of this here. So if we take away our catching of random parameters, it fails. So I do not feel like I have a strong enough sense of what's going on there with the ordering of arguments being passed in and whether they're keywords versus names versus args. So I'm just going to pass on that for now, just because I feel like my attempts to explain it will just confuse you more. And we're just going to continue with non-named parameters. So like we passed in here with we're just passing in parameters. We're not saying what goes where, and we're relying on the order here. Okay, so we're creating an image with too much data. And when we do that, we're getting the error, and it takes exactly 6 arguments, 7 are given. Now, someone might count the number of arguments being passed in here and say, hey, we're actually only passing in 6. But there's an implicit argument of self that's being passed in here. And that'll catch you up if you don't know about it and you're trying to compare the number of arguments being passed. Great. So let's go ahead and put our solution back in here. And now this test should pass. We should have 3 passing tests. Oh, right, because we have not asserted anything. We can just cut and paste this assertion, because if it exists, it will have the class we want. Why do we only have... I have very little idea of why we only had 2 tests here. Oh, right. You may have noticed that I just copied and pasted the name of the test. So the tests have the exact same name, so they're just counting as one test. I actually don't know whether it just runs them both and if there's an error in either. I guess what's happening is it's running them both, and if there's an error in either. So it's basically just collapsing the 2 things together. So let me just first works. So I gave it a separate name and it's created the 3rd test. So this gets to the question of whether you can have multiple assert statements in the same test. And the answer is that you definitely can. So for instance, we could say self-assert equals, we could take test object dot image or creator name and copy this here. And we should get 3 passing tests again. So it's running both of those assertions. Some people like to limit the number of assertions in a single test definition. Some people say you should only have 1. And that's because the test will go through the assertions and it will stop with that test as soon as it hits something that fails or throws an error. So let's say we had this here, and this is wrong. Add some question marks. Now we're only testing that first assertion. We never get to that second assertion. So if the second assertion relies on the first assertion, the same way that this does, it doesn't really matter whether or not these strings equal each other, because if the first assertion fails, that means that the object doesn't even exist. And in fact, this assertion will throw an error because it'll say, what's test object? So in this particular case, I think it's fine to have multiple assertions. But the rule of thumb is generally, if you're in doubt about whether something belongs in the same test case, make a new test case for it. Because the goal of unit tests is just to get as small and isolated as possible. So that's part of why that is. Great. So I want to get to a couple of other different types of testing. I just want to briefly talk about one other feature of unit tests, and that is the setup and teardown methods. So the setup and teardown methods allow you to take repeated code out of your test methods and put them into a single class. So I'm going to call this setup. So in this particular case, we can move this to the class. And when you do this, you want to assign whatever variables you're going to reference again to self, so that the unit test suite, so that they're within scope when you're running the tests. So in this case, you can now just type self.testObject class and self.testObject creator name. And if you wanted to create something that tested that object, for instance, test rendering of adorable image object, you could just use self assert equals self.test object render and get whatever it is you get from there. That will fail until I fix it. But basically, you can make your tests very short and sweet. And then so this could be self incorrect or too much data test effect. And then you reference that down here. And this we need to keep the creation inside because it's during the creation that we get our type error. So that's setup, and what happens, the setup method will run before every single test. So if you're like looking at the flow of this, you'll see setup, test create adorable image object, correct data, tear down, setup, test rendering of adorable image object, tear down. As a note, you can't actually rely on your tests being run in the order that you've declared them on the page. The default sorting method for unit test is, I believe, actually alphabetical / alphanumerical, which is alphanumerical where numbers are assigned a value that's greater than or less than letters. Just basically alphabetical, but it might look a little weird if you put numbers in your test names. So one way, and this is considered, because unit tests are supposed to be so isolated, it is, it's considered not a big deal that you can't really, it's hard to predict the ordering of your tests. And the common response to someone saying, hey, I want my test to run a particular order is like, change your tests so that they don't depend on the state of a previous test. That being said, there are cases where it's valid to want that, but then you have to either like be really careful with your naming schemes, or you have to hack unit tests to use a different sorting order, and that's high-level stuff that I've never even bothered to try. So like 99% of the time, you actually just want to make sure that they don't require, that there's no need for the state of one test to depend on another, except for what's happening in setup and teardown. So I'm not going to declare a teardown here because there's nothing really to tear down. But if your setup involves using a test database and populating a test database, or changing something, like if you have text fixtures that you're altering in some way, you can put in teardown to get it back to its default state, for instance. So setup is something you see a little bit more often than teardown, but does happen. Cool, so I'm just gonna pause and check questions. Cool. Yes, I agree. Let's post something about this arguments business later. Cool. Okay. So this is like this is the basics of unit test. But I wanted to get a chance to get to browser testing. So actually, let's go back to createsite.py. And the Python testing demo up here has a lot more detail about both the section we just completed as well as the process of extending the site. But I want to make sure we get to stuff in time. So I'm going to skip through a bunch of things, but I do recommend going through and reading through this, and it'll be roughly corresponding to what we're doing here today. But rather than building out the site to be a bit more complicated, what I want to do is just move on to testing with Selenium. So Selenium is a tool for doing testing in the browser, and it's not a Python-specific tool, but there's a specific library of what's called bindings, Python bindings for Selenium, called Selenium Python. And I actually have, let me take a look at my import statements. Here we go. Simple way to grab it. So we're going to import from Selenium, we're going to import a WebDriver, and we're going to import a sub package of their Selenium library called keys. And we'll use them both in a minute. So we can just go ahead and put our Selenium tests in with the rest of our unit tests because they're an adaptation of unit tests. So let's just do a quick Selenium Python test. Go to getting started and just get the basic syntax. So you can see here that it's just inheriting directly from test case. So we don't even have to inherit from anything from Selenium. And so we can do UI test case. We can go ahead and do test that we create a page. Let's go ahead and grab that syntax again. I'm going to start with something simple before we break it out into setup. So we use this basic. So we'll do this test here, which is basically we create a WebDriver for Firefox if you don't have Firefox on your computer. Although, why don't you? You can use Chrome or Opera or any one of this list of like 10 or 15 different browsers that you can use with Selenium Python. And then we tell that driver to get a specific page. This is from their example. So they're having get python.org and look for the word Python in the title of the page that's got. So before we test our own page, let's just go ahead and see what that looks like when we run it. Should I not? Oh, I see. I need to start my virtual end. And now that I'm in here, it should. There we go. So we've got some errors. I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but you can see that it opens up a browser and looks for the word Python, and that particular test passes. 2 other tests fail. Right. When we refactored, this is a note, when you refactor your tests, it's important to make sure they all still pass. So, So we're testing, just to go back and fix this quickly, the test object here should be, I think I changed that just to show an error. But the name of the test is create adorable image object with correct data. And so we should be testing it against correct data, not incorrect data. So I feel comfortable changing that. And then the other one is an empty rendering thing. Right, so that was just that was just an example to reuse. But I'm gonna go ahead and copy and paste this because it is in fact the rendering we expect. And now our test shall pass. Great. So it's kind of annoying that this thing stays open. So this is a perfect opportunity for a teardown class. So let's create our teardown and type driver.close. And actually, let's put setup self. We can put this here. And we have to make sure that that refers to self. And then we have to make that refer to self. Everything's got to be self. And let's go ahead and change this to be our own page. So the URL for our page is here. And we can't check this anything in the title because we haven't put anything in the title. But we can change that by creating a new template that's let's call that title template or page title. And then we can just throw this in here. Before we start rendering our objects, we can say, right. Let me just render it. We need to fit in a title. Let's call it adorable images. That should work. Note that let's run create site now. There we go. Oh, that's just me having a typo. Oh, I see. There we go. That's misspelling something. Oh, it's page title, not title. All the tiny little things that can go wrong. There we go. And so now when we refresh this, we see that our title is adorable images. And so we can now check for that in the unit tests. You'll note that if you look at the view source on this, it is absolutely horrifying HTML. Like we don't even say that it's HTML or that we've got a head or a body. But luckily, browsers are very tolerant, and we're getting it to look the way we want it to. But certainly, you'd want to do a lot more if you were actually putting this site online somewhere. Great. So let's go back to our tests. And we are now going to look for adorable images. I wanted to do test project. Great. And you can see that it teardown successfully closes the driver. And our test passed. And in fact, we can say not just assert in, we can actually say assert equals, because we know that it should look exactly, should have exactly that string in it. If you go and look in the project demo, there's a little section where comparing equals, assert equals and assert in and another one which is called assert. I think it's assert in regular expression, or assert is regular expression, where you can feed a regular expression in, which is useful if you want to check that something has a certain structure, but you can't say exactly what it'll look like. So in this context, it was creating the title of the page out of the name of the image, and you knew it had the form of animal-number.file name, but you didn't want to say specifically what the animal, the number, or the file name was, so you can create a regular expression. I just like regular expressions a lot. Anyway, not really particularly relevant. But so you can choose your assertion. You can tweak your assertions to fit the case that you want. Great. So let's say we test a couple of other things. So define test test number of images. We can do, so with Selenium Python, you can search for elements in sort of a similar way as you can with something like jQuery or XPath. You can actually specifically use XPath within the Selenium Python binding, so you can find element by XPath. So this particular case, let's call this images and say find element by name. We don't want by name, we want by, maybe we want by name. We want to find all of the images. So we don't actually want to find by name, we want to find by something else. CSS selector. So that's this one down here, find elements by CSS selector. If we do element, it'll return an element if it finds it. And if we do elements, it'll return an array of elements. It's the main difference here. So we're looking for images. And so that will be an array. So then we can say, okay, there's 2 images being put in. So we can say assert equals length of images and 2. Hopefully that'll work. Oh, no, we got an error. What happened? Global name driver is not defined. That's right, we have to have self.driver. Try that again. Well, I guess a failure is better than nothing. 0 equals 2. So we didn't actually find what we wanted to find. Elements by CSS selector. So yeah, we should be. Find elements by CSS selector. Let's see if it gives us an example so we can see if we've done something wrong. The documentation of CSS selectors. Does it have, no, it doesn't have an example image. Maybe it won't let us do image. That seems unlikely. All right, so I don't know exactly what's happening. And if we had all the time in the world, I would take that time to debug. But instead, what I'm just going to do is add a class to all of our images that says animal image. And run create site.py. And now I should be able to, in our tests, that's going to change this here. That's going to fail in a minute. But now we can find elements by class and then animal image. All right, let's see if that works. Nope. Still failing. Oh, maybe that's the other one that's failing. WebDriver object has no finds elements by class. I think it's by class name. That's what's going on. Still 0. Interesting. Gonna check in on the chat in case. Find by tag. Sure, let's try by tag name. This is the kind of stuff that happens all the time when you're developing tests, but you kind of wish wouldn't happen in a live demo. Still 0. All right. So can we get find elements to work on anything? What's something that should work? Whoa, it's an unusual. We're unable to locate element. Huh. So it wasn't that they were unable to locate it before, it just had a length of, all right. When in doubt, I always say, use a print statement. So I'm going to run this and just see what's happening here. Hopefully. Oh. Right by class name. So it's an empty list. All right. In desperate times, you go and look at the thing you did the day before. This is just what I had before. All right, and we're looking in here and we look at our page source. We have our, oh, well, I guess it's true that we haven't. So this find elements by CSS selector should be able to get A. Yeah, I got nothing. Oh, I guess as a side note, that's not images anymore, it's links, but it's worth noting that we don't seem to have added, successfully added a class name here, so maybe that's part of the issue. I'm just going to try this for a minute more, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Yeah, interestingly, when we generate the site, all right, so we're defining my template here, should be getting fed in here and rendering out. Oh. Interesting. Maybe that'll cause the changes. All right, so I'm not entirely sure what's going wrong here, but I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're getting sort of close to the end. So oh, no. Yeah, well, I'll just check and see if any of you guys have figured this out. Interesting. Okay, so not going to worry about it too much. It seems like a shame. Well, I could just skip the rest of what I was going to talk about because this is what testing and debugging are part of the same thing. So I don't want to just kind of give up on it. But I am confused about why things don't seem to be appearing. Oh, there it is. Did I just not refresh? Could it possibly have been something as simple as not refreshing? We'll find out. If it is, I'm just going to bang my head against the computer laptop. CSS selector by class name, animal image. No, it's still failing, which I guess is kind of hopeful because I didn't really want it to be that I hadn't refreshed anything. But yeah. But we can now, I'm going to follow Carol's advice and copy from this existing try that syntax, see if it works. Still not working. Oh, all right. I think I have possibly figured out what's going wrong. So it's difficult to see because everything is happening so quickly. But let's see if we can do, I'm going to add a timed sleep after each. This is actually a great bug to have. It's actually a useful bug. I'm glad about that. It's not a dumb bug. All right. So we get to our tests. We wait 2 seconds. Nothing happens. We open it up again. So what's actually happening is if you look at this set of tests, I've put the driver get, where we actually get the page. I've accidentally kept it inside an individual test, which means that when we set up the test again, we're going back to blank and we're not going back to that page. So one thing I can do is put this here, and that should cause it to pass, or I can go ahead and put this in the setup method. And you can see now we only have that one failure that's happening in the render one, which I'm just going to comment out because we don't have much time left. Great. So one last thing. As with so many bugs, the issue wasn't where we thought it was in the precise use of Selenium, and instead just in a logical error that we'd made or /I'd made. So probably most of the things we tried were in fact correctly looking for the thing that we wanted them to look for. We just didn't have the page open. But I do just want to talk about one more thing. So we have our setup method and our teardown method. There's one additional thing we can do, which is called setup class and teardown class. And those happen at the beginning and end of the full test suite. So we want our setup method to go back to the start page before every test to keep them isolated because we can't depend on the order. But we don't need to assign the WebDriver, Firefox WebDriver in every setup. We can in fact assign that at the very beginning. The syntax for this is define setup class. And the syntax here is a little bit funny. We need to decorate, we need to use a Python decorator to indicate that this is a class method, because I don't actually know that much about class methods, but it's not as straightforward as just a simple method. And we feed it in CLS instead of self, but we treat CLS like self. So we can say driver is this. And that should work. And we can actually go ahead and put the teardown in its own class as well. And put this here. And that'll save us a bit of time. We only have 2 tests right now, so it's not that much time saving. But if you have 50 or 100 different browser tests, not having to open and close the browser each time will save you quite a bit of time. So we'll see that we do both of our tests very quickly once we have the browser open. So again, setup class happens at the beginning of the class of test cases. So here, so I guess the sort of order is, so if we assume that we're using an alphanumerical order for the tests, what's actually happening is you'll set up class, set up test number of images, set up test that we create a page, teardown class is the order that we're actually doing. So yeah, so we're at 12:50 now. I feel like we lost a fair bit of time to a bit of debugging, and also didn't get to have as many discussions as I would have liked. It feels a lot like I'm just talking to myself here. But hopefully this was an enjoyable experience, and hopefully I'll get better at doing this type of hangout in the future. So we have 10 more minutes. So if folks have questions or things that they want to take a chance to dive into more deeply, I would be very happy to answer them. And I'm just going to look in chat and on the Pirate Pad to see. Yeah, the Pirate Pad didn't really get used. But if you want to restate any questions from the past, because the chat is quite long. Thank you, Carol. Carol said something nice in chat. So someone has asked, I'm kind of like skimming the long log and taking random, looking for just things that end in a question mark. So there's a question of when I started programming tests. And so this is actually a bit of a story. So SciPy is a fantastic library, Python library / project that, I mean, it's used by scientists, mathematicians, data scientists, all sorts of people, and it's primarily used for statistics and data analysis and data bunching. It's sort of the Python equivalent of R. I happen to like it better than R, but as you are. Anyway, so I wanted to contribute to SciPy because I liked it so much. And SciPy has a really great set of tests. They have a fantastic test suite that they maintain very well. And it was the first time I'd tried to contribute to a project or worked on any kind of project that had tests. I came from academia where they didn't even teach me version control, let alone automated testing. So in any case, through the process of making a couple of minor contributions to SciPy, the very helpful contributors there taught me how to use their test suite. So that impressed on me the value of a test suite, but I was still a little intimidated by it. And so there's a great intro to unit tests by that Ned Batchelder, who goes by Ned Bat frequently and in many places, gave in 2013, I think. It might be 2014, one of the two. It's a great talk on just like an intro to unit tests. And after seeing that, I felt like sort of comfortable starting to use unit tests or trying to use unit tests in my own stuff. And then once I was doing unit tests, I was like, oh, there has to be a way to also test the way everything works together. And that's when I found out about Selenium and Selenium Python. And I just I forget if there's a specific tutorial that I used there. I agree, Carol, Ned is great. Cool. So yeah, that's a sort of question of when I started testing. So that would have been about 2.5, 3 years ago that I started doing testing, and I still don't do it for all of my projects. Again, it's when I feel like I have a lot of complexity to manage. That being said, I would default to using tests because sometimes you don't expect things to get that complex and then they are complex and you haven't been doing any testing and then it takes forever to get your test suite to match your stuff. Cool. So yeah, Hankush's question is, someone once told me it's a good exercise to write tests before you write the code you're testing. I have some trouble thinking this way. Have you tried this exercise? Would you recommend working through the mental block? I have tried it. I think most people refer to this, or I think to the extent that this has a name, I think it's called test-driven development. And I made it most of the way through Obey the Testing Goat, which is a popular resource for learning test-driven development. It obviously didn't stick for me. I think a lot of the times when I'm doing testing, when I'm writing code, I don't actually know all of the features that I want ahead of time. I mean, a lot of this is because I do a lot of personal projects where I'm just like fiddling around with things. And so I don't really know what I want well enough to define a test of it. That being said, it is really good to know what you want ahead of time, and test-driven development can really push you to articulate what you actually want your program to do. So, I mean, I think as with a lot of things, it's a judgment call, feel your own way. I would recommend trying it. Like, if nothing else, come up with like a super simple toy project that you can really define well ahead of time, push yourself to define it and do test-driven development just for an afternoon, just so you can see what the process is like. And once you get the hang of it, you might end up doing like mini cases of test-driven development where you have something well-defined within a broader project. And you're like, for this particular feature, I'm gonna write the test first. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Cool. I have time for a couple more questions. Again, feel free to ask questions in chat that are moved over from the Pirate Pad or restated from before, because this is a long transcript and I'm sure I'm missing things. You are welcome. You are welcome. Let me just take a moment to go back to, I guess I can undo the screen share, but take a moment to go back to this repository, which I learn by reading as well as by listening. So if you're one of those people, I think you might really enjoy it. And it's basically going through what I just took you through, but in more detail, covering more things and explaining things more eloquently because I wasn't improvising them on the spot. Just a thing to note about this is that I very much welcome either pull requests or just requests for clarifications on the issue tracker. I did, in fact, write all of this yesterday, so I'm sure that there are typos, errors, and just things that could use more explanation. So please feel free, if you do end up reading through this, to open up an issue in the issue tracker. Cool. If there are no other questions, I will go ahead and end this. Oh, I had a thing I wanted to say. I'll go ahead and finish up. Testing is great. PyLadies is also great. You are all great. And I hope that this session has been enjoyable for you. Ooh, another question. Excellent. Because we still have time for a question. Oh, this is like one of those really deep questions that seems like you should be able to answer it, but actually there's not necessarily any answer possible. Okay, so once you decide what to test, how do you know the test you've written is correct? There's no guarantee that the test you write will be correct. And in any given case, when you have a test that's failing or giving an error, the best answer might be to change the test to fit the code, or it might be to change the code to fit the test. Figuring out whether or not the test is correct or even just satisfying really requires you to engage with it. The types of things I like to keep in mind when considering whether or not I'm satisfied with a test is, one thing I like to ask myself is, does this test reflect what will actually occur with the code? So we actually had an experience like this like an hour ago where we were creating a test, and I think it was create the adorable image object with too much data. And we got the test to pass when we gave it a random parameter, but we didn't actually solve the functional problem, which is what do you do when you give it too much data? And so we had to go back and alter the code as well as alter the test. And so a lot of times you're creating your tests and your code in tandem. And the real value of the unit test is not to prevent you from having to think in depth about your tests ever. It's about allowing you to think about them at specified times, such as when you run your unit tests or when you run your tests, and also to keep you from forgetting things, like forgetting that a change in one place might cause problems in another place. Sort of like a push notification of potential errors rather than, or I guess it's a pull notification, but you know what? That's a confusing analogy. Forget about that analogy. In any case, so you never know for sure that the test is correct, or that it remains correct after you make changes. I just try to make sure that my tests correspond to behavior that I actually expect to see, or that the tests correspond to the behavior that the actual code will be dealing with and the situations that the actual code will be dealing with. And that when I write a passing test, that the fact that the test is passing means that the code itself is behaving in the way I want it to, and not just that I've adapted the test too much to the problematic behavior of the code. Cool. So one last thing, I was thinking, when I made my list of topics, I was also going to cover just what fixtures and factories are in Mock. So we didn't really get to that. They're kind of advanced topics. Basically, fixtures and factories, really briefly, are terms for tools that you use to handle test data. So we're using a very, very simple toy project, but you might be wanting to test a dynamic website that has, dozens of database tables and how they interact with each other. And so you might use fixtures and factories are two different methods for handling that. And then mocks are a tool for maybe you want to test how your code interacts with some sort of outside thing, but you don't want to actually connect to that outside thing. So for instance, let's say you want your code to be able to deal with random ping notifications on IRC, but you don't actually want to send, like you don't want your test to rely on someone on the other side of the country pinging you. So you need to create a mock which will basically pretend to be that outside source of data, that outside library that you can't actually test. So that's very briefly what that is. If anyone is excited by those topics, I'm thinking of adding them to this already apparently too long demo in case I ever give it again, which I probably will. Okay. All right. I think I'm done. Thank you all so much for your questions. I hope this was helpful. Yeah. Hold on, I'm gonna undo screen share, which I stop screen share. I can say goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.